How do you wet sand scratches out of car paint for beginners? It's actually not as hard as you might think. What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the Wilson Auto Detailing community. Listen, in the detail garage today, I have a car that I actually own, but it's a test subject car. I don't drive it. We test chemicals on it. We do tutorials on it. And today, I want to show you guys who are not yet wet sanding, but are doing paint correction and maybe some surface level polishing in your businesses, how to implement this skill into your business in a safe way, but also in a profitable way, and teach you guys why this might not be something that you want to implement in your business. At a very surface level, I'm going to apply a finishing polish to the paint over the scratch that I want to deal with. Let me do that really sped up and think about why I might be doing that before I introduce the sandpaper. Here we go. Now, speaking of doing this for ceramic coatings, make sure if you guys want to get into applying ceramic coatings the right way so that you can cash flow them in your detailing business rather than just learning how to do them so that you can spend money on product, go below in the YouTube description box. We've got a free 5-part video series called the Ceramic Coating Quick Start to teach you not only how to apply ceramic coatings without risk of damaging anything, but also how to get customers to make money applying ceramic coatings in your detailing business. That free 5-part video series is below in the YouTube description box. Grab that before we continue in the video. Now, one might ask, why would you polish over the scratch before we do this? The reason is, if we can make this background really polished, or let's just say really quickly polished, I'm going to be able to see this scratch better than if I've got a bunch of swirls around it. The other thing to consider here is different levels of the scratch are going to sit at different depths into the clear coat. This is not all sitting beneath the clear coat at the same level. Therefore, like you can see here, the middle of the scratch has basically polished away. This used to connect right here. Now we've got some chips up here, a scratch right here, and a scratch right here. It almost looks like 3 different imperfections because this non-diminishing abrasive polish I just used polished in between, and this apparently was a surface enough level part of the scratch to come out without any wet sanding. Now, as we get into this, remember I said above the scratch we've got some rock chips that are all the way through the clear coat, all the way through the color coat, all the way to the base, the metal part of the door panel itself, right? It's through the primer, it's to the base. And that, of course, is not going to be fixed by what we're doing here. What we want to take is a real life scenario like this. See if we can take some sandpaper to it and see what level of the scratch comes out, what level of the scratch doesn't come out, and can we mask it enough to justify not taking all of the scratch out so as to save some of the clear coat. Let's go ahead and get into the wet sanding. Now, I've got my detailing light sprayed on the paint here so that I can see this scratch with a little bit more visibility. And the other things I'm going to be using here are really simple. A Rid stick, which is going to act as my sanding block. These are put out by Jason Kilmer. I will link these below. I am using a 3000 grit, small, let's say 2 by 2 inch piece of sandpaper from Meguiar's and some water in my spray bottle. Why am I using a 3000 grit piece of sandpaper? The reason being is because as we talk about how to introduce wet sanding for beginners, it makes the most sense to start with a really high grit sandpaper so as to, number one, reduce the risk of running through the clear coat all the way, and number two, in some ways this is going to be the easiest and lowest barrier of entry sandpaper to use because as we go up in grit, we glide across the paint a little bit smoother for obvious reasons. And one of the tricks here to sanding is not necessarily how quickly we can do it or how much of the scratch we can take out, but more how evenly we can actually sand any given part of the vehicle. Meaning on the left side, I'm not going too deep, while on the right side, I'm putting less pressure and therefore not going as deep. The idea is to create an equal amount of pressure as I move across the car paint. Now I'm going to be taking my Rid stick. One of the sides of this particular type of sanding block that I will link up below has, let's say, some peeled edges. It's got some smooth or rounded edges, and that's actually the area that I want to use as I am using or wrapping my sandpaper around the block because it's going to in some ways account for my user error. I'm not trying to wet sand show cars that cost $1 million. My wet sanding consists mostly of very light to pretty serious individual scratch removal, and sometimes, of course, a wet sanding step before a compounding, polishing, and ceramic coating. So that's what my professional detailing world looks like in terms of my wet sanding, and that's why I use it like this and kind of account for my margin of error, because in situations like that, we can have some margin of error versus something like a show car that cost $1 million where there is no margin of error. So I want to use the rounded corner side of my block, put it right in the middle of my sandpaper, wrap each edge of my sandpaper around this block. I'm going to take some water, spray it on my sandpaper. I'm going to spray it on the scratch itself. Then I'm going to touch the sandpaper to the paint. I'm going to move the sandpaper across about 10 times, meaning back and forth is 1, back and forth is 2, back and forth is 3. I am not going to be putting any pressure down. And as I hold it between my index finger and my thumb, I'm going to be putting my pinky at kind of a level playing field with the sandpaper on the paint itself so that the pressure is not being pushed down, meaning my pinky is kind of like a buffer between the pressure of me pushing or leaning in accidentally and, of course, the pressure being transferred to the paint. So I've got my pinky down here at the bottom of the sandpaper as well, and I'm moving across the scratch just like this. Okay, that was about 10 times. You can see about right here in the camera, there's now kind of a chalky appearance, and I can see it showing up in the camera pretty well. This chalky appearance that you're looking at is nothing more than cloudy and removed, at the end of the day, clear coat. So this is where I have sanded the paint. Now, what I'm going to be able to see is that this scratch right here is still in the paint. It's still really clearly in the paint. So I want to go ahead and do exactly what I was doing with that 3000 grit sandpaper until I find it a little more difficult to see or pick up on this scratch. Now, this is a bit of an oversimplified approach, but the reason we're doing it this way is because this is a very common scratch. I doubt it's going to come out all the way, but as I use my 3000 grit sanding paper, this is going to be relatively easy to not just manage my risk, but also to see if this is a scratch that's worth continuing with at some level, and I'll show you what I mean as I get down to a more, let's say, base layer of the clear coat. Now, some people will inevitably ask, how do we know how much clear coat we're sanding away? The simple answer is we don't know exactly how much clear coat we're sanding away, but as we get that chalky buildup right here, as you can see, this wet slush, of course, that is removed clear coat. Now, like I said, this is a test subject car that I don't care anything about, and if we went through the clear coat, that would actually be another great lesson simply of looking at how long it takes with something like 3000 grit sandpaper and let's say about 3 to 3.4 mils of clear coat, how long it takes to go through on a car like this. Now, the other question that is inevitably going to be asked is, Luke, would you be sanding like this in the real world on a real customer's vehicle? Because you seem to be going back and forth a lot and you seem to be removing a lot of clear coat. Would you actually do this in real life? The simple answer I can give you is no. I probably would not do this in real life. Reason being, in my opinion, it makes a lot more sense to keep the clear coat on the vehicle in this area, lower rocker panel, where there's a lot of stuff that gets kicked up. But for the sake of the video here, this is going to be very informative and kind of help us understand the nature of wet sanding, maybe even a little bit more. One of the things that I'm beginning to see as I wet sand more of this scratch away is that at the base of the scratch, or where the scratch actually starts, there is essentially a rock chip. And because of that, that part is never going to be fixed fully, but we can fix where the scratch comes out from the rock chip, even if the rock chip is going to stay there permanently. Now, as I keep going, one of the other things I'm going to see is that naturally the scratch disappears a little bit or begins to fade. So here's what I want to do. Now, I want to give you guys a good look at what this looks like, and I want you to see a couple things here. Now, we're talking about this at a beginner level, but a couple things to notice. Number one, This is the rock chip that I'm referring to. It might not be a chip, but it is a place where there's a tiny chip in the paint that has gone all the way down to the base metal of this door. That is never going to be fixed. This is the scratch that's coming out from the chip, and that scratch used to be visible until about, let's say here, if you'll remember from the beginning of the video. Now we've eliminated a lot of this trailing portion of the scratch. However, this maybe, let's say, 1/4 of an inch line coming out from the chip is still visible, and we've not yet sanded up here to try to remove this scratch. These are the rock chips that are going to stay there regardless. This scratch has not been done. A couple things to notice about the scratch pattern here. Number one, this is not the best scratch pattern that anybody is ever going to see. And what I mean by that is there is some unevenness in the pressure, as you can see. Down here around the borders, there's a little bit, let's say, more pressure or consistency of scratch, and down here in the center, not quite the same, and up here, because we weren't focusing up here, this is an area that was kind of scratched over a little bit and missed altogether. This is a good analogy or picture of what I'm talking about when I talk about the pressure you're putting on the paint. This is naturally going to happen as you're just using your hand because it's not exact, meaning you're not using a machine, so we're not going to get the most even pressure. But if I was wet sanding for 30 years, yes, there are guys out there who can get this completely perfect. The problem is, like I said, I'm not dealing with $1 million Lamborghinis when it comes to wet sanding. That's not where my cash flow comes in my business, in this particular part of my business. So this type of scratch pattern, no one is going to notice the difference if you're not been doing this for 20 years, and it's something that anybody can do. Now, I want to go ahead and move off of this scratch, and I want to move up here right about right there to see if we can take this scratch out. Then we're going to come in and polish with a simple non-diminishing abrasive polish, because this is a 3000 grit scratch pattern, and see what we can see. Guys, check this out. What we see right here is that the scratches are still there. A couple things to note here. Number one, that means, hey, even with us wet sanding across just like we just did, these scratches are still there. They're not going to be removed. If we could go further, do we really want to go further? I don't really think so. What I'm going to conclude about this is that this scratch that's left here and this tiny scratch that's coming off from the rock chip, that's just going to stay because it's not worth the cost of removing more clear coat. I also want to show you, yes, there has been more of the middle part of this scratch removed than there was originally just by polishing. So now that we looked at a scratch that is not going to be removed, I want to show you guys some scratches that definitely can be removed. Right here, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are really, really bad scratches from, let's say, a dog hanging out of the car, or maybe snow and ice falling off the car. We want to go ahead and wet sand this area right here to see what we can do. Guys, I want to show you the final result really quickly, and what I want you to compare this to, obviously this is where the scratches used to be. Let's check out what the before looked like. Here's what the before looked like. You can see obvious clear difference, right? They're been wet sanded away, polished away. Now, you know, this part looks fantastic. You can also see, of course, on the top part of the door here, these are some of the remaining scratches of what the befores looked like. And of course, as you move down, you see that those have been wet sanded away. I did not polish very long. I polished maybe let's say 20 to 25 seconds. I need to do a little bit more polishing to remove a little bit of the sanding marks I have up here, but you guys get the point of the video here. Those scratches are now gone, and you can see some of those scratches scratches still exist like over here, but again, this area where we wet sanded and polished, they are now taken care of. So that is how to wet sand scratches out of car paint for beginners. We suggest using that 3000 grit sandpaper, some very easy to use sanding blocks like those Rid Sticks from Jason Kilmer. They're probably the best out there, particularly for beginners, because there is a margin of error built into them that will hedge against your inexperience. Now, like I said in the beginning, if you guys are interested in wet sanding paint correction, but particularly for the purpose of ceramic coating vehicles and increasing the cash flow in your detailing business through ceramic coatings, make sure to go below in the YouTube description box, grab my free ceramic quick start. This is going to teach you guys not only how to apply ceramic coatings for beginners, but also how to sell this service, cash flow it in your business, and start bringing in ceramic coating customers today. It's a free 5-part video series below in the YouTube description box. Make sure to grab that. Guys, if you like detailing business tips and how-to videos like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button because we come out with weekly videos multiple times a week, not only doing how-tos like how to wet sand, but of course also how to cash flow this type of service in your detailing business. And of course, all of the tools and products, the sandpaper, the Rid Sticks, the lighting I use like my Multi-Match 8 light, everything will be linked up in the YouTube description box below so you can easily find those tools and products if you're interested in getting your hands on them or just looking at the pricing of those things online. As always, guys, thank you so much for being involved, and from Luke here at Wilson Auto Detailing, keep working hard, and I'll see you guys in the next video.